Before the outbreak of the Second Punic War, the Carthaginians in 221 BC signed another treaty with Rome, which essentially carved up Spain between the two great powers. Everything south of the Ebro River belonged to Carthage. Rome had rights to everything north. The treaty was signed by Hasdrubal, not Hannibal. Shortly after the treaty was signed, Hasdrubal was assassinated, and Hannibal was elected as the next commander. Livy gives an interesting assessment of Hannibal's character, and I quote, "There was no leader in whom the soldiers placed more confidence or under whom they shared more daring. He was fearless in exposing himself to danger and perfectly self-possessed in the presence of danger. No amount of exertion could cause him either bodily or mental fatigue. He was equally indifferent to heat and cold. His eating and drinking were measured by the needs of nature, not by appetite. His hours of sleep were not determined by day or night. Whatever time was not taken up with active duties was given to sleep and rest. But that rest was not wooed on a soft couch or in silence. Men often saw him lying on the ground amongst the sentinels and outposts. His dress was in no way superior to that of his comrades." End quote. Now, although Hannibal's grand scheme was to launch an invasion of Italy and take the fight to Rome, he needed to first wrap up operations in Spain. He knew that he needed to crush any significant opposition because, as we know now, Hannibal wanted to establish his base of operations in the Po, and therefore if anything went wrong back in Spain, he would not be able to easily make it back to the peninsula, especially since there were two massive mountain ranges and mighty rivers between Spain and Italy. Also, Spain provided enormous wealth and war material to Carthage. To lose it would be catastrophic. And so Hannibal's first priority was to complete the conquest of Iberia and secure his interests there. One immediate problem that needed to be dealt with were the Iberian tribes that were in revolt. And as he was returning from a campaign, several Iberian tribes decided to take Hannibal's army by surprise near the Tagus River. You can see the Tagus River in this map right here. It cuts a path right through the middle of Spain. Now, usually this is an unfortunate circumstance when you are caught off guard by the enemy. But this was Hannibal, and he was always prepared to make the most of any situation. A quote from Napoleon comes to mind here. "A commander-in-chief ought to say to himself several times a day, if the enemy should appear on my front, on my right, on my left, what should I do? And if the question finds him uncertain, he is not well placed, and he should remedy it." And I think this quote applies to Hannibal. He was always looking to take advantage of a changed situation. He relished the opportunity to defeat his enemy. This reminds me of Alexander when he had his lines of communication cut off by Darius. Alexander didn't panic. He simply turned his army around and defeated the Persians at Issus. Now, the Iberians formed up into an extremely large and dangerous force of 100,000 soldiers. The allied tribes set up a very strong position at this spot against the Tagus River. Hannibal set up camp a short distance away. Now, this is where Hannibal shows an early mastery of rivers. Rivers then and now have always played a decisive role in determining the outcome of battles. If we look at a more modern battle, the Battle of Stalingrad, it was control of the river crossings that played a fundamental role in deciding the outcome. As long as the Red Army held both riverbanks, they could ferry supplies and men across at night and keep the German 6th Army pinned down in the city. Even though the Germans carved the 62nd Army in half, the Soviets were able to hold those vital river crossings. Eventually, this bought the Red Army enough time to build up their reserves and launch the greatest counterattack in military history. 23 centuries earlier, it was no different for Hannibal. And Hannibal's mastery of rivers is something to be admired. Now, as I said, the Iberian tribes set up a strong position against the river Tagus. Hannibal deemed it wise not to attack such a heavily fortified position, something his enemy undoubtedly expected. But Hannibal was the master of the unexpected, and so he simply fortified his own camp to prevent the enemy from launching a surprise attack against his own position. Hannibal decided to gain the other bank of the Tagus, but any crossing was a treacherous endeavor, especially if he was attacked while fording the river. Hannibal decided to take the possibility of an attack out of the equation by setting up a ruse. He left his campfires burning, along with a token force to maintain the illusion that his army was still encamped. The rest of the army, under the cover of darkness, crossed the Tagus. Earlier in the day, his scouts had located a suitable crossing just up the river from where the Iberians were located. The next day, the enemy assumed Hannibal was in retreat. They began to cross the river in hopes of intercepting Hannibal. But as soon as the enemy began to cross the river, Hannibal ordered a massive cavalry charge to challenge the Iberians' passage of the river. Livy said this contest was so one-sided that unarmed cavalry could have done the job, since many of the Iberian infantry lost their footing and were swept away by the river. Those that survived the initial charge were hastily trampled to death by Carthaginian elephants. At some point, the tribesmen began to finally form up, but before they could mount any effective charge, Hannibal ordered the infantry to advance, and that effectively ended the battle as the rest of the Iberians fled. And so Hannibal had his first major victory. It would not be his last. And with that, he set up winter quarters at Cartagena. Thus, Hannibal had nearly all of the peninsula south of the Ebro under his control, save for one major city. With the Iberian tribes broken and then subdued, Hannibal had yet another obstacle to deal with: Saguntum. Saguntum was one of several Greek cities along the eastern coast of Spain. Saguntum, according to Livy, was the richest and most prosperous. Saguntum looked at the Carthaginian expansion in Iberia with great alarm. They saw their lucrative trade with the Iberians threatened by Carthage, and so Saguntum looked to Rome for protection. Though by treaty, Rome was not allowed to deal with Saguntum since it was south of the Ebro. Nonetheless, Rome signed a treaty. For Rome, this was a golden opportunity to curb Carthaginian growth in the Iberian Peninsula, even though once again it violated the treaty signed in 221 BC. But the temptation was too much. Saguntum was a well-fortified city that could give Rome a foothold in Iberia, and also provide a base of operations. This was also the reason, according to Polybius, that Hannibal simply could not afford to leave such a city behind him before he embarked on his epic journey to Italy. Hannibal also knew that any attack on Saguntum would undoubtedly result in war with Rome, which is what he wanted anyways. Time, though, was not on Hannibal's side. He needed to end this siege quickly so he could begin his preparations for Italy. So in 219 BC, the Carthaginians arrived on the outskirts of Saguntum with, according to Livy, a sizable force of 150,000 men. However, this would be no ordinary siege, for Saguntum was a defensive stronghold. The city was on top of what was essentially a massive rock that was several hundred feet above the plain below. The city dominated the entire landscape. Despite being menaced from all sides, the city remained absolutely loyal to Rome and made preparations for a lengthy siege. They did this by stockpiling food and equipment. Hannibal first ravaged the surrounding countryside. He then immediately set up a line of circumvallation around the entire city. He also placed most of his forces at the western side of the city. This apparently was the easiest slope to ascend. But according to Livy, this area was also defended by large walls and huge towers. The Saguntines saw the threat posed on the western side of the city and placed their best defenders on the portion of the wall where Hannibal was concentrating his forces. The besieged at Saguntum undoubtedly hoped for relief from Rome, but amazingly Rome sent nothing other than a meager protest. Polybius even criticizes Rome. Here, Rome had a chance to pin down Hannibal in Spain. You have to wonder a few years later, after the destruction of the Roman legions in Italy, if the Roman Senate regretted doing nothing to help Saguntum. Despite Rome's indecisiveness, the defenders at Saguntum mounted a ferocious defense. Every attack by Hannibal was thwarted. Livy states that the Carthaginians suffered as many casualties as the defenders. Hannibal himself was wounded during one of these attacks. And so the siege went on and on with neither side budging. Adding to the frustration for the Carthaginians was the fact that the ground was unsuitable for siege warfare. It was essentially too rocky to try and construct a mound of earth, which would have made it easier to circumvent the walls. Eventually, Hannibal opted to pull his forces back and keep the land blockade intact. The Carthaginians used this time to construct the necessary siege devices needed to launch another assault against the walls. With their siege equipment ready to go, the Carthaginians pounded the walls of Saguntum with battering ram after battering ram. The continuous grind eventually took its toll, and a portion of the wall collapsed. The Carthaginians now believed that finally the city would fall, but the defenders had other ideas. A colossal struggle broke out at the breach, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The defenders, according to Livy, used an iron-tipped javelin that caused serious damage. Eventually, the defenders were able to break the Carthaginian attack, and Hannibal's troops fell back in disarray. In fact, the Carthaginians were pushed all the way back to their camp. The defenders used this precious time to repair the wall. Hannibal, though, remained undeterred. He now promised his troops that all the spoils taken from Saguntum would be redistributed to the army. According to Livy, this had the effect of greatly boosting the morale. Hannibal now erected a massive siege tower on rollers. The tower itself was taller than the walls of Saguntum. This allowed the attackers to rain down missiles on the Saguntines, and eventually the Carthaginians were able to drive the defenders away from the wall. Hannibal then ordered some of his African troops to undermine the now undefended wall, and in short order another portion of the wall came crashing down. Another battle broke out inside the city, with neither side giving any quarter. But slowly and remorselessly, Hannibal was beginning to make progress, though both sides suffered appalling casualties during what turned out to be almost continuous fighting. A short time later, yet another portion of the wall was ripped down, and now the defenders had no choice but to retreat back to the citadel. A fresh assault was launched by the Carthaginian army, and another brutal, bloody fight commenced. With victory almost a certainty, Hannibal offered the people of Saguntum harsh terms: surrender and go into slavery. But Saguntum refused, and apparently many opted for suicide by jumping into a massive fire that had been started. In any event, the Carthaginians eventually stormed what was left of the citadel. All adult males were executed, with the women and children sold into slavery. The city was then burned to the ground. The siege would end up lasting 8 brutal months. But in the end, Hannibal achieved total domination of the Iberian Peninsula south of the Ebro. This siege showed Hannibal's absolute determination to achieve all of his goals. So much so that Polybius states, quote, Hannibal could be found urging his troops on and hurling himself recklessly into the fray. Hannibal now took up winter quarters in late 219 BC. Just a few months later, in 218, he would begin his epic campaign against Rome. In the meantime, Rome, who failed to send even a single legion to help Saguntum, did dispatch embassies to Carthage. And we will get to that in the next video.